This episode of the World War II podcast is brought to you by forceswarrecords.co.uk. Forces War Records holds a vast array of military records from before the Napoleonic Wars through to the modern day. It's a great resource for anyone starting to look into their history and exploring their family's military service. For a 40% discount on 1 month or a year's subscription, use the offer code WW2podcast. Hello and welcome to another World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. In this episode we'll be looking at the Red Cross parcel scheme, which supplied millions of parcels to prisoners of war from both sides of the conflict. I'm joined by Mark Webster. Mark has researched the Red Cross parcel scheme organised by the New Zealand Red Cross. His book, Parcels from Home, is available on the Apple iBook store. Incredibly, 1 in 200 of the New Zealand population became prisoners of war, mainly due to 4 disastrous campaigns that the 2nd New Zealand Expeditionary Force took part in during the first half of the war. As a result, New Zealand would pack by hand 1 parcel for every 1.7 of its population, a huge undertaking. Even the US, which took its parcel scheme to an industrial level with production lines and conveyor belts, only managed 1 for every 6 of its population. These parcels proved to be a lifeline for those men in the camps. Mark, thank you for joining me. Let's start with a look at the International Red Cross set up by Henry Dunant. Where did their wartime remit come from?
Well, it all goes back to that Solferino, the famous sort of Solferino thing, where a Swiss businessman had sort of strayed onto the battlefield afterwards and found all these dying people. So he came up with the Convention of Geneva, which said, we should have international agreements and have a group of people who look after people who are injured, because in those days nothing was done. And so they came up with a convention that people became signatory to. And if you're a signatory to the convention, then and people went onto the battlefield under the symbol of the Red Cross, then they had the right to be safe from, you attacking them, and they were expected to look after people injured. And this got developed, and more countries became signatory, and then conventions were added to the original convention. That's why they call it the Geneva Convention and the Conventions of the Red Cross. So after World War I, where prisoners of war weren't very well looked after on either side, some were obviously better than others, but they added a whole lot of provisions in the 1920s specifically for prisoners. And these were the ones that directly affected the prisoners in World War II. Luckily, New Zealand had signed that. Or I think they came under the British Red Cross anyway, so because Britain had signed, we'd signed, same with Canada and Australia and South Africa.
We signed for you.
Yeah, pretty much, because the Red Cross in New Zealand at that point was a branch of the British Red Cross. Although the 100th anniversary of the New Zealand Red Cross being officially becoming an organisation was the 10th of November 1915 was when it was inaugurated as an official Red Cross branch. Luckily, New Zealand had become signatory to that, and nobody anticipated the amount of New Zealanders who would be captured, and they were captured in a very short period. And it was a huge amount by New Zealand standards, totaling around 9,000 in the space of a year.
This is World War II.
In World War II, yeah. In World War I, there were only a few hundred New Zealanders taken prisoner. And in World War II, it was more like 9,000. And only 300 of those were taken by the Japanese. The rest were all in Europe. And that's a difference between New Zealand and Australia. So New Zealand and Australia sent soldiers ostensibly to Britain, but they got diverted to Egypt and fought in North Africa. And then once Pearl Harbor happened, Australia withdrew its soldiers to defend Australia, but New Zealand left its soldiers in North Africa and didn't really take part in the war against Japan in a major way, although they raised an army division in the end and put that into the islands. They were never really in the front line. And there were a few New Zealand pilots, and the Navy was involved in the war against the Japanese, but most of our forces were involved in Europe. So they fought the North African campaign, skipped Sicily, were regrouping at that point, and then were shipped to Italy, and then took part all the way from the south of Italy all the way to Trieste, and that's where they ended the war. They were in Greece and Crete, and they were both disasters. And then there were another 2 disasters in the desert for El Alamein, and that's where most of our prisoners were taken.
Well, that's an interesting point that you make about how they were captured. I mean, I assume at the start of the war, everyone thinks they're going to win it, so there is not a lot of provision put aside for things like parcels and relief. And then you get these, you get the Dunkirks where tens of thousands are captured. As you say, Greece and Crete, more or less, huge swaths of New Zealand troops were picked up in one go.
Yeah, 2000 in Greece and 2000 in Crete.
Suddenly, a nationality has lost a large chunk of people. Was they were they prepared for these? I mean, when the war started, did they start boxing things and getting prepared for these kind of prisoners of war?
Not at all. It was a complete disaster. The papers in the Red Cross archive in Wellington, they show the scramble to cope. As the news started coming in of the amount of soldiers that had been captured. 1,856 were captured in Greece and 2,180 in Crete. So almost half of all the New Zealanders captured in World War II were captured in a 2-month period. It's pretty shocking. So that the Red Cross, you can see that they're already packing sort of what they call comforts for soldiers, which are just little parcels with, soap and a sewing kit and a few things like that in it. And suddenly they're going, wow, what about all these prisoners? And the British Red Cross was already supplying parcels to prisoners because the British Army lost 50,000 around the time of Dunkirk. So they already had a significant amount of soldiers in German prisoner camps. So there was already a parcel scheme. But then New Zealand started trying to pack specifically for POWs. And in the initial period, because they wanted to get New Zealand branded parcels to New Zealand soldiers, or at least have, be a significant player in that realm, they actually bought parcels in Canada and they contracted to the Canadian Red Cross to supply parcels on behalf of the New Zealand Red Cross. And they did that for 3 months. And then in that period of the Canadian Red Cross making parcels for New Zealand, then the New Zealand Red Cross was gearing up to do its own parcel scheme, and then it sort of kicked in the last months of 1941.
Why did they feel the need to supplement whatever they were being issued in the camps?
When you're a signatory to the Geneva Convention of the Red Cross, then you were supposed to feed prisoners of war the same rations that you gave to not your frontline soldiers, but your second-line soldiers. So, the rest of your armed forces that weren't in the front line, you were supposed to give them a similar ration. And that was pretty meagre. I'm not sure if the Germans did that to the letter of the law. The Italians certainly didn't. Most of the prisoners taken in Crete and Greece were imprisoned first in Italy, and there was a lot of corruption. Even when the parcels arrived, they'd often been pilfered. The Germans were much better at respecting the sanctity of the parcels, if you like, than the Italians were. It really wasn't sufficient to keep these guys going. I think they just realised that these guys were a long way from home, and anything that they could do to help them was going to be appreciated. But a lot of the guys that are interviewed mentioned that without the parcels, they would have been dead in months because they were also having to work. They reckoned there were 1.5 million POWs working in the German war economy. And that's heavy work, clearing rubble, forestry, working in mines. And the theory was they weren't supposed to do anything that directly helped the war effort, but clearing bomb rubble, is that contributing to the war effort or not? But so that kind of thing. So every soldier who wasn't a commissioned officer was expected to work, and they were paid in scrip, which is camp currency, which was pretty useless, and there was nothing to buy anyway. But they had to work, and there were instances of officers, New Zealand officers, and probably with all of the armies, pretending they were privates so that they could get out into the work camps because they were getting so bored. And there were also instances of private soldiers and sergeants and corporals pretending they were officers to get out of doing work. So the 1.8 million is the official figure of what they think POWs were contributing to the German economy one way or another, working on farms and mines and rubble clearance and that kind of thing. And especially in winter, I mean, the rations that they were on were just not sufficient. And I guess the German army itself must have been on the point of starvation by the end of the war, but everything had got pretty rough by then.
So who decided what went into the parcels? I mean, was there a framework within the Geneva Convention to say what was acceptable and not acceptable?
Yeah, there was a lot of a lot of discussion. And over here in New Zealand, there was a woman called Dr. Muriel Bell, who was a nutrition expert at the University of Otago. She tried to work out the best calorific intake for people in those conditions, and she did a very good job of it, apparently. So the parcel contents, like we list them quite extensively in the book. I mean, they're fairly similar from country to country. You know, you had that thing where if you're an English POW and you get an English parcel, then there's things in it that you know. There's that nostalgia thing. And then to get a parcel from America or Canada or South Africa or even Argentina was sending parcels, or a New Zealand parcel, you know, because all of the parcels were mixed up. You could get any kind of parcel. It was pretty much potluck. So then you had a bit of variation as well. And, you know, whole camp economies sprung up around the contents of these parcels, so that the non-smokers made a great trade with their cigarettes, because that was the camp currency. They'd trade cigarettes for items that they liked. You know, they'd run around, you know, does anyone got a parcel from America? I really want the Spam or whatever, you know, or the brand or the Hershey's chocolate and things like that. So, you know, it really kept these guys going.
So they're like a large shoebox, aren't they?
Yeah, I think a large shoebox is probably accurate, and they really pack them in closely.
So they sort of have a tin of meat, some sort of powders of some description. Did they have any non-food stuffs other than cigarettes in them?
No, not really. But every single element of everything was used. You know, the tin was beaten out and made into implements. The cardboard was used. The string was made for all sorts of things. There were stories of entire football nets being made, you know, for the goal nets being made out of the sisal. You know, imagine how much sisal string you would have to gather up to make a net that fitted into a goal. But they kept the guys busy. I mean, that was another thing. Boredom was shocking, you know. So, yeah, sardines, all that kind of stuff, just high calorific. Fat was one of the things that I hadn't really taken into consideration was how valuable fat becomes when food is short. And New Zealand was shipping fat to England, like long after the war, just pure fat. It's kind of incredible.
And how often, what was the frequency that each POW could expect to see a parcel?
Well, the target was one parcel per prisoner per week. And I think that's the factor that really got me interested in the book in the first place, is that 99 point something % of the parcels actually reached the prisoners. And the New Zealand parcels, so we sent just over 1 million of them in total. I mean, to go all the way across the world through this huge war and actually arrive, almost 100% arrived in the hands of a prisoner, to me is incredible. And when you think of a New Zealand soldier stuck in a freezing cold prison camp in Poland or somewhere, suddenly getting a New Zealand parcel, you know, with New Zealand things in it. And it would have been the same for all the other prisoners, of course, as well, the Americans and the English and the South Africans and the Canadians and so on. I mean, just that sort of connection across the planet. And I mean, it's pretty incredible even without a war going on, I think, especially in that kind of frequency. But
that's right. And New Zealand is probably as far away as any of the parcels was coming from. Shall we look at the logistics from from source? How were they put together in New Zealand?
So there were 4 main cities, still are in New Zealand: Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch, and Dunedin. And so the things for the parcels were gathered all over the country, and they were all sent to Wellington. And
were they purchased or were they donated?
Some of it was donated, but there's Red Cross figures for various amounts paid for various things, and the government helped. So the government had they kind of nationalised the donation thing. So all of the voluntary agencies that raised money were kind of brought under the umbrella of the government in that time, so that they could be coordinated effectively. And so there was a massive sort of government effort to get things to the Red Cross and other agencies. So there's a lot of government documentation around this as well. So there's a whole thing, for instance, where the New Zealand Prime Minister Peter Fraser is insisting that New Zealand-made cigarettes, because we used to have a tobacco industry, were put into the parcels. And there was a lot of to and fro between Wellington and London about the types of cigarettes and the types of tobacco that were being put into the New Zealand parcels, and which were to go into the parcels specifically for POWs and which were to be sent to England to be put into other people's parcels. So there's all of that kind of carry on as well. So, yeah, all assembled and packed under police guard, by the way, as well.
Oh, really?
In Wellington. Yeah, they had police officers stationed in the packing centre. And apparently I spoke to a boy who was there on the day that the millionth parcel was packed. He had to go to a dental appointment in Wellington, but his mother had a packing shift first, so she took him with her, and he was there on that day. So he told me that the women had to bring in their own tea bags or their own tea leaves. They couldn't be suspected of pilfering from the parcels. I'm sure they didn't, but we had rationing here as well and things were getting tough. So everything was very carefully monitored. The packing rate was incredible. They got really efficient so that the efficiency rate just kept going up, and this is all faithfully recorded in the Red Cross minutes and compared to the American rate of packing and the English rate of packing. So they were really onto this stuff.
Well, in some respects, because you got so many, other than the British, you got so many prisoners in the bag early, your scheme, certainly by the time the Americans came into the war, will have been quite advanced.
Yeah, but the Americans had sort of conveyor belts, and and I think the English ended
industrialised.
Yeah, and the English ended up with 16 packing centres. We only ever had the one. The one in Wellington started off in the Red Cross headquarters, and within a year had to be moved to a bigger site in Tory Street. So they found a bigger site and fitted it out, and all of that was paid for with donated money, and it was a bit closer to the docks, and so they set up a much more efficient packing service.
So when they've got these boxes, I presume they put them on crates, and then they move them they ship them. How do they ship them?
There was 8 cartons to a case, and at the beginning the New Zealand guys were making the cases, because that was heavy work, but by the end women were doing that as well. They were doing everything. And then they were loaded onto a ship, and then the ship went across the Pacific, through the Panama Canal, turned left and went north to meet off Newfoundland and joined the convoy system, and then was convoyed across. That's the route. And then at first they went to Portugal, because Portugal was neutral. So they took them to Lisbon and then put them on trains, but this was not effective. And this was all of the parcels. So this was American Red Cross parcels.
So everything came into Lisbon?
Yeah, Canadian parcels, English parcels. And the other thing to remember is that the Germans were doing the same thing in reverse. So the Germans were shipping stuff to Lisbon too, and they were being put onto English ships and taken to German prisoners in England and German prisoners in Canada. The parcel thing was going both ways.
It would be interesting to see what the Germans thought of the parcels that they got. Especially if they were imprisoned in Canada or America, one would have thought they were actually pretty well fed, and the things that the Germans were pushing back would be second-rate cigarettes and nut coffee.
Yeah, there's stories about that. There's a great story with one of the guys that we got to interview. He got given a packet of Polish cigarettes called Junex, Junex. He was disgusted by these things, so he heaved them over the tailgate of a truck into a slave labour camp in Germany somewhere. And there was a mad scramble, and the SS tracked him down and tried to try him, but it was in a camp run by the German army, and the German army refused to hand him over. But so their cigarettes were, very inferior. And that was another thing too. They used to bribe the German guards with these, much better cigarettes.
They're foreign imports. Did they lose a lot of shipping on the way over? Through the Pacific, were they harried? Obviously the North Atlantic convoys were hazardous, but did a lot go in the Pacific?
German raiders that came as far as New Zealand and sank several ships around the shores of New Zealand and Australia. And in fact, there's some islands off the coast of, quite a long way off the coast of New Zealand, called the Chatham Islands. And there's a little sort of packet boat that used to go between them once a week. And this thing was intercepted. Everyone was taken off and it was sunk. And 3 months later, the Germans left them on an island in the Pacific. I know somebody who knows somebody that was on that boat, and she still had a book that one of the German sailors had given her, like a children's book in German. So they're quite nice to them. So there was a little bit going on around here. And then it was even a Japanese submarine went through the Cook Strait, and twice Japanese aeroplanes flew over. One flew over Wellington and one flew over Auckland. So that kind of brought the war home to, it must have made people here feel really weird about the whole army being in Europe.
So we get to Lisbon. What is the problems with the rail system from Lisbon?
Yeah, there were lots of problems. So the first problem was that between Portugal, Spain, and then France, there were two different gauges of railway. So that was the first problem. Second problem was, of course, Spain had the Spanish Civil War, so a lot of the infrastructure was still wrecked. Third problem was Spain had terrible flooding, which had affected the rail lines. And then the fourth was that the rail lines after Spain went through Vichy France, and that at a given point, Germany took over Vichy France as well. So it was never satisfactory, and there was a lot going missing. So they started experimenting with ships going through the Mediterranean. And the first ship, most of the cargo didn't arrive. The ship did, but the Red Cross parcels were gone. So then the Red Cross, they weighed in on a sort of international scale and had meetings with the German Admiralty and the German government. And then a week later, they were in London. So there's this lovely story of these two Red Cross officials being in London at the Admiralty in London, listening to the Germans bombing London while they're trying to convince people to not attack these ships that would go through the Mediterranean. And of course, a week before they'd been in Berlin. So this strange feeling.
It's a good story, that, because people aren't necessarily aware that things did move from occupied Europe. There was a communication route via Lisbon. Obviously, the Swiss supplied things to the British.
That's right. And the Germans. And vice versa. So, I mean, there's a lot of food that the Swiss couldn't grow themselves that they were importing from, not just from Germany, but from Italy. But they were shipping ball bearings to England. And Portugal was trading with both sides as well. Of course, so was Spain. I mean, Switzerland's effort was kind of intriguing as well. You know, at the same time that they were building these huge warehouses and filling them to the roof with millions of parcels and distributing them very effectively. And this traffic was going both ways. So there were German parcels going to German PoWs as well. They were shooting down Allied planes that overflew Swiss territory.
So how did the parcels from the Med get to, well, let's look at the Med. So how safe a passage do they had from Lisbon round to, is it Marseille and Genoa?
Yeah, that's right. So,
that was a heavily contested piece of water.
It was, yeah. So they painted the ships white with a huge green stripe around the hull on both sides, and then big red crosses on the hull and on the top. And they also had to light them at night. So they had lights all over them shining onto the red crosses. And, so these ships were really brightly lit. There were a couple sunk even though they were brightly lit and very well marked. But generally speaking, it was pretty effective.
So they got through. So they unload onto the trains. The trains get free passage to Switzerland then?
Yeah, Vallorbe and Geneva in Switzerland. And then they were stockpiled and then they were parcelled out, literally, on trains. And that's another lovely story as well. At the end of the war, the Allies, had complete air superiority, and they'd bombed the rail system into oblivion, and it was no longer possible to even get a white painted or Red Cross marked train safely through anywhere at that point. So they came up with a scheme of getting hundreds of American trucks and painting them white and having these trucks delivering parcels. And of course, at this point, the German borders had shrunk and they were being attacked from all sides, and they were force marching prisoners away from the front line. And these trucks would show up and hand out parcels and drive off again, which is incredible. Not a single truck was shot, and not a single driver was. They were all volunteers, and most, some of them were American, was hurt or injured or captured. So it's incredible what the Red Cross could achieve in this war. And we all know what sort of things the terrible sort of things that went on in this war.
Yeah, I've met people who've been on those long marches as they emptied the camps, and it was a horrendous experience, especially for some of the, because some of them were on the road for months. And it is
That's right.
Absolutely incredible how the Red Cross kept track of these people and their movements, because there were not even planned routes they were taking. They were just told to march away from the Soviets as they were coming, just march west, and we'll we don't know what we're going to do with you. Yet the Red Cross could track them.
That was another thing, is like once you were captured and you went into the system, and at a certain point you were registered with the Red Cross. And this went for every single prisoner of each side of each country that was involved. In the period between capture and registration, pretty much anything could happen to you. Because you weren't registered, your army probably listed you as missing in action. You'd probably hope they'd show up wounded and not dead, or they'd show up, or they'd turn out to be prisoners. But in that interim period, which could be a couple of weeks to 3 months, there wasn't much care So that was the most dangerous time to be a prisoner. Once you were registered and you were in the system, you were pretty safe, unless you were from one of those countries that wasn't a signatory to the Geneva Convention, like Russia or Japan. Then it was a different story. That's a strange thing as well, because that went both ways. So because Russia had not, or Soviet Russia had not signed the Geneva Convention, the Germans didn't even begin to bother to look after Russian prisoners. But of course, in retaliation, the Russians did the same thing back to the Germans. And there's another sort of funny, well, not funny, but strange incident where the Japanese didn't sign the Geneva Convention charter that specifically dealt with prisoners either. So, they treated their prisoners really badly. But we had 800 Japanese prisoners of war in New Zealand who were getting Red Cross parcels.
Were these Japanese did they just get Red Cross parcels? Did they specifically get Japanese Red Cross parcels?
No, they got New Zealand ones. The Japanese had a Red Cross. This is something I'd like to explore more, but in this version of this book, which is about to come out, the Trainspotter version, there's a whole chapter on the war against Japan, because only 300 New Zealanders were captured by the Japanese, and only a few of those were military. Most of them were, like English teachers in Shanghai, or living on plantations in Malaya or something like that. But the fascinating part is that the Red Cross was desperately trying to get parcels to all of the prisoners of the Japanese. And of course, after the war, at near war's end, they started getting a few parcels. Some people only got their parcels after the Japanese had surrendered. One internment camp wasn't liberated until November, when the war finished in August, and didn't know until they were liberated that the war had ended, and then got some Red Cross parcels. They found buildings full of telegrams that hadn't been delivered to soldiers, either from families to the soldiers or vice versa. They found warehouses full of letters that hadn't been delivered, and they found storehouses full of Red Cross parcels that the Red Cross had managed to get to near the camps, or some of the camps, but were never delivered. And the Japanese, in many cases, didn't even open them themselves. Even though they were starving, they just put them in buildings and left them. One guy got a parcel from his family in America, an American POW. The parcel had been in transit for 3 years, so the chocolate had turned into sort of grey powder. One guy got 1/17 of a parcel once. So one parcel was given to 17 people, and they tried to divide the contents up 17 ways. It's just...
It was dire.
No, it's terrible.
Once these parcels arrive at the camps, what happens at the camps? How are they distributed?
Well, they were put into a storehouse, and then the person of confidence, so there was a person of confidence in every camp who liaised between the prisoners and the prison authorities. It was usually a prisoner. And that person of confidence was responsible for unlocking the storehouse once a week and distributing the parcels. But there's one guy, one of the people that we got to interview, they'd fiddled the lock so they could all get into this storehouse whenever they wanted to. But they didn't steal the parcels. What they did was they smuggled the parts of a radio into a parcel and kept it in there and would access it that way. So there's a lot of sort of fiddling going on. It's quite funny.
But the parcels were always sacrosanct.
Sacrosanct, yes. You can imagine a train leaving Switzerland, reaching the German border, getting all of the German guards on board, and then delivering, a train groaning with parcels full of amazing food from sort of all over the world, and these hungry guards in the cold sitting on these things and, not touching the parcels. I find that kind of hard to understand, considering some of the things that the Germans were doing.
It's incredible that they offer up guards when, their backs to the walls, yet they are diligently guarding these trains for prisoners of war, carrying food for prisoners of war.
There are very few cases of the parcels being interfered with. Even, the Channel Islands, they got a parcel distribution in 1944. I know about this because some of the parcels were New Zealand parcels. Even then, they found, I think it was 30 cartons of cigarettes had been stolen, but there were thousands of cartons of cigarettes on the ship.
I think you quote 19,411 packets of cigarettes, of which 30
That's
were
right.
missing.
That's pretty incredible, isn't it?
Which is just incredible. It's incredible that someone bothered to count 19,400 and to discover that you would have thought that as a rule of thumb that we've got about
exactly.
enough.
Yeah, exactly. Part of the fascination of this whole story with me is that everyone likes to get a present. And every time you got a parcel, it was like getting this package of joy. And some of the stories of, the getting a first pack of tea, for example, or making your first pot of tea after 3 months, just the feeling of that. And yeah, it's quite lovely. There's a story about Gunner Jim Henderson, who's like a famous New Zealander who lost a leg and was captured in North Africa, and who was an officer, and he wrote one of the official war histories. He's a fascinating guy. He was in a hospital in Italy with the guy in the bed next to him was a Greek. And this Greek finally got a Red Cross parcel, and he was transported in joy, and it's a lovely story. But then they realised that the contents of the parcel are printed on the cover, and of course the main Italian guard has like nicked about 30% of it. So this guy's joy is sort of short-lived, The Italians were much worse than the Germans at that kind of thing. And then, of course, they had that terrible thing where they changed sides, but did it so obviously and telegraphed it for so long that the Germans were waiting to take over all of the prisoners as soon as it happened. A lot of the New Zealanders went on the run at that point, and some of them were captured and some of them died. And a few of them actually made it back to New Zealand forces. Yeah, there's one guy, Ted Sutton, and he actually lived 2 streets from where I live in Grey Lynn. I was really fascinated to meet his daughter, and she had his diaries, and he went on the run in Italy, and this guy was absolutely incorrigible. Finally got caught by the Germans, ended up in the German camp. When they came to put them on a forced march, he dug a hole under the hut and hid in the hole until the camp was empty, and then emerged, immediately busted open the Red Cross store, lived like a king for a week with another few prisoners who'd done the same thing. And then the army showed up and he was taken to Brussels, because all of the POWs were taken to Brussels and then flown to England, and then the New Zealand ones had a week or 2 weeks in England and then were put on a ship back home. But he went on a drinking binge in Brussels and disappeared for another week. So just after he was liberated, he went AWOL again, and he'd gone AWOL several times. So his army record is hilarious, because he's a corporal, and then he's busted to private, and then he's a sergeant, and then he's busted to private. And of course, the New Zealand army had constant problems with this guy, but the Germans had the same thing, and so did the Italians. And then when he was finally liberated, he just carried on the same way, Finally got back to New Zealand in 1946. But he ended up at one point with Marlene Dietrich sitting on his knee, and there's a picture of it, but he lost it. This is one of his stories. Yeah. And of course, this drinking binge he went on was with the Australian pilots who were supposed to be flying him back to England. These are the guys he went on this drinking binge with.
Tall tales. Was it just Red Cross parcels that the prisoners received? Or did they receive anything else?
Well, they did. There were YMCA parcels as well, but nowhere near as full on a scheme.
Did families, could they send out parcels? Was that part of any scheme?
Yeah, that's called the next of kin scheme, so the NOC scheme. They were allowed to send one parcel every 3 months, and that was totally prescribed what you could put in it and what you couldn't put in it. So obviously pistols, files, that sort of thing, compasses weren't allowed to be put in, and things like socks and things, not even chocolate, I don't think, but eventually they were allowed to put chocolate in. And these were all censored. So you'd send it to the post office in your town, and the post office would forward it to the Red Cross, and then the Red Cross in the 4 main centres of New Zealand, and this would have been similar overseas, they unpacked the parcels, censored it, made sure that everything was kosher, if you like, and then they'd top them up. So, they'd put a few extra things in if they thought it was a bit meagre, because some of the families obviously, didn't have as much as others. And then these would be sent to the prisoners as well. And that's one of the funny things I found is complaints. There's a whole series of letters in the New Zealand Red Cross archive from a New Zealand soldier in a German prisoner of war camp who's complaining that he hasn't got his boots yet. And there's quite a lot of to and fro. And in the end, the Red Cross reply is kind of like, seriously, sir, don't you realise there's a war on? We're really trying to get you these boots. Which is quite funny. But, I think you become a bit sort of focused on yourself when you're stuck in a prisoner of war camp somewhere and you've been there for a year already.
Well, there is that thing about the boredom, and then there's, as we've touched upon, what the ingenuity of using the things that were not necessarily meant to be used within the parcels, such as the cans. Tell me about the blower stoves.
Oh, these are incredible. So, and there's a really good museum in New Zealand in the middle of the North Island, and WWII. There's a huge army camp in WWII, and has been for probably 100 years now. There's a really good army museum there, and they have this archive of photographs, some of which I've used in the books. But they also have 3 of these blower stoves. two of them at least are authentic from prisoner of war camps that these guys brought back with them. And one of them, I think, is sort of a mock-up. What the Red Cross didn't really take into consideration was that if you send someone a can of Spam, you best want to cook it, especially in winter. Like cold Spam, when it's minus 20 outside, is pretty disgusting. So the camp huts tended to have a stove, but they were inadequate, and then fuel was very scarce very quickly. The guys were constantly shaving bits off their beds to burn. Late in 1940, sort of around mid-1942, they started developing more and more efficient ways of burning fuel, like a small amount of fuel to get the maximum amount of heat to cook something to make it palatable. And this system sort of evolved very quickly into what they call a blower stove, which is a little forced air furnace. You have a little like a hearth or a hot plate or whatever, where the flame is, and then you put a little bit of kindling on there, and you put a pot of water above it or whatever you're trying to cook, and then you would light this, and it would have a blower that you'd hand spin, and this would force air onto the little firing area, the furnace area, and you could boil a billy of water in under a minute, which is pretty efficient. So a very tiny amount of kindling. You could use a Red Cross package as the kindling, or the wooden cases that they came in, they'd chop them all up. And the entire blower stove was also made out of hammered out tins, discarded tins, scraps of string and leather, and there was a trade in things that would be useful in these things. And some of the guards could be bribed to bring you in maybe a better piece of leather belt to make the fan with, and so on. These things evolved very quickly and got more and more complicated. And the guys building these sort of things were known as tin tappers. And the tin tappers were became sort of like mini gods of the prison camps, because they were worth a lot of supplies. Like if you could get someone to make you a good blower stove, it was worth giving them all of your best sort of Red Cross parcel contents or whatever. Yeah, so that they were incredible, but there was a lot of ingenuity. And I often wonder, the sort of things that the guys would have come back with, the sort of skills that they developed, like what sort of impact they had on society. It wasn't just the New Zealanders making these stoves. I mean, I think it started with British prisoners, and there was a lot of to and fro. So the camps were very mixed up. So you'd never get a camp of just New Zealanders, and pretty much every hut was, you'd have a couple of English guys and a couple of maybe Canadian, a couple of Australians, a couple of New Zealanders, a couple of Americans. They didn't tend to mix up with the French very much, or the Poles, but that happened a little bit. So the Germans segregated them a little bit more. And the Germans had an entire hierarchy of which prisoners were on which rung of the ladder kind of thing. And they were very particular about that. There's all kinds of strange camp hierarchies going on, and all this sort of weird trade of little artifacts, and then guys furiously making things that were useful. And yeah, the blower stoves were pretty amazing. I can never understand why somebody didn't make that into like a commercial product after the war.
Once I'd heard about them, it did have me scrabbling on the internet to try and find a picture of them. I used to go to Scouts as a kid. One of the guy who ran it, he'd been in India and in Burma during the war, and he used to have us all making Benghazi stoves, he used to call them, and they were kind of like
burners. Yeah,
that's it, with like a bean tin, with a smaller bean tin in the centre with sand round, and you fill them with petrol.
That's right. Yeah, very popular in the desert.
Right, and I thought, I wonder if that's what you were talking. These blower stoves, and I had to look them up. Okay, I see how they work, but they're not quite what I expect them to be. They are a very intricate little piece of machinery.
Yeah. And some of them were chain driven, some of them were driven with a belt. And one guy would crank the handles furiously, and that would force the air onto the flame, and that would burn very fiercely for a short period, and with an intense heat. So yeah, pretty incredible. I mean, some of them had toaster racks and things on them as well.
But you can see why, if you have nothing to do all day, especially because some of the officer camps, they didn't have to work. If you have nothing to do all day but think about food, and all you've got to play with is tins and bits and pieces in these cartons, how you can sit and daydream additions, innovations, just sat around chatting, coming up with these things.
There was a thing in the camps too, which went through the entire sort of experience of being incarcerated during the war. People who would give up and people who wouldn't. Some of the veterans talk about, there was always a guy in the hut who didn't really take part. And they often didn't survive, or they ended up with psychiatric problems, or they were moved into the hospital, or that kind of thing. So the guys who would take who'd get the Red Cross parcels of books and, you know, read them and swap them and join groups and make little theatre groups and all of that kind of thing, they tended to prosper. And a big part of that was making useful things out of what they could, and trading, and of course a lot of gambling going on with cigarettes as the stakes, all of that kind of thing.
Well, there must have been obviously a lot of smoking. There would only be limited to how much they could physically smoke.
Yeah, I guess so. And, you know, the desperation when your cigarettes ran out, that was quite a big factor as well. And
no doubt it would be boom and bust. So you'd get a lot of cigarettes, then you would have none, and then you get a lot and you have none. So
that's right. And that was another whole sort of facet that I'd sort of forgotten about. You know, I mean, I grew up in the era when a lot of people smoked, but the Red Cross was shipping cigarettes to the hospital ships. You know, like measuring them in, you know, almost by the ton. You know, this hospital ship for this trip needs, you know, 1.5 tons of cigarettes. So, and they were handing, you know, the doctors would be smoking while they were handing them out to the patients they were working on. It's incredible.
It's another world, isn't it?
It was, yeah.
With the surrender of Germany, did the parcel scheme just stop, or how did it wind up?
Well, in the New Zealand scheme, anyway, they carried it on for a little while to send to England because of course England had been bombed and food was always short. So, I mean, a lot of what New Zealand was doing during World War II was feeding the American troops in the Pacific and shipping food to England. And so the parcel scheme kind of switched. So there were more parcels of clothing sent as a change. Although clothing parcels were a big part of the parcel scheme as well. But to England after the war, that they sent a lot of clothing and also still a lot of food. And the New Zealand government carried on shipping food to England for a long time. So one of the things that happened in New Zealand in 1944 was that the New Zealand population voluntarily reduced its butter ration so they could send more to England, which is quite nice. People ask me why I'm so fascinated with this war, and I'm not actually a very warlike person. To me, World War II in particular, it involved, you know, everybody that was alive in that period was touched by the war. And also, the thing I love about the Red Cross story is that there were ordinary men and women, mostly women, and a lot of children, packing these parcels, and they were being shipped to these soldiers who could no longer fight because they were in prison camps. And they were going through all of these different hands in all of these different places and going on these huge long trips and arriving in the hands of these guys. You know, a lot of ordinary people were thrown into extraordinary circumstances by this war. And the amount of stories that come out of human courage and suffering and sort of ingenuity, and I just love it. It's just endlessly fascinating.
That seems like a fitting place to leave things. Thank you, Mark. Mark's book, Parcels from Home, is available in the Apple iBook store. The updated version, as well as audio clips, now has video. It's a lovely book, and I highly recommend you go and seek it out. I'll put the links on the website. In our next episode, we'll be looking at Richard O'Connor, whose 1940s victories in the desert have now been largely forgotten. Don't forget, for updates and episode-related extras, you can follow us on Facebook, and there is the website, WWII podcast.com. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.